So last week we got to the part of Jesus' sermon where he was talking about being salt and light. And for the next 2 weeks, we're going to get into the parts of his sermon that deal with our heart issues. Now, in the beginning of this series, I was emphasizing how Jesus, throughout this whole sermon, the whole Sermon on the Mount, there are these undertones of wanting to deal with our heart issues. And so for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be covering the specific things that he mentioned concerning our heart. So in Matthew 5, Jesus begins with what would have been a very uncomfortable statement for his hearers. The reason for this is because his hearers, they would have held the Pharisees in the highest regard. They were the pastors, the leaders, the spiritual advisors of that time. So they looked at them in very, very high regard. Well, in verse 20, Jesus makes this statement, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So that'd be like today, you're sitting in church and Jesus shows up and he says, "Oh, you guys like Pastor Josh? Well, unless your righteousness exceeds that of Pastor Josh, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven." And I think some people would be like, "Oh yeah, I'm good. I'm way above where he's at." And then others would be like, "Oh, this is not even worth trying then, because I'm not there, you know?" So that was a shock to them. So why would Jesus say that? Why would he say something that is so abrasive? First of all, Jesus said a lot of things like this that were abrasive because he's trying to shake people out of their complacency. He's trying to shake people out of their, being stagnant and just go, "Man, you're not seeing the truth. You're not seeing the world right." So he's just kind of shaking them out of it. Why would he say that if their righteousness did not exceed that of the Pharisees, that they weren't even going to make it to heaven? Because he saw past the Pharisees' outward behavior. And what the Pharisees had was they had the outward behavior right, but their heart was so ugly. And the point that Jesus was making here is he's saying righteousness with an ugly heart is still sin. Just because you're doing what looks to be right on the outside, but your heart is wrong, it's still sin. So what he's actually revealing to his hearers is the Pharisees are actually sinners. They're not right with God. All they've done is reform their outward behavior, but their heart is still ugly before me. Then he gives these specific examples in verse 21. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother is liable for judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says 'you fool' will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift." So he began by saying that their righteousness needed to exceed that of the Pharisees, and then he gives examples why. He said, okay, so for example, you think you're righteous because you don't murder. But he said, but I'm trying to get you to understand that having anger in your heart towards brother, which can lead to hatred, is the same thing as murder. So he said, it's not enough just to not carry out the act. We want to look at what's going on in your heart. Then he says, if you call someone a fool, you're in danger of going to hell. Now this is so, I think, difficult for people to hear. Because I mean, we call people fools when we're driving around. We call them a lot more than that. Just driving in traffic, you may say something worse than this. So Jesus said, you call somebody a fool, you're in danger of hell. Now, is it because that's just the taskmaster that God is? Like he's so meticulous about every little sin that even if we just call somebody a name, we're going to hell? I don't think that's what's going on here. Again, he's trying to get us to look at the heart. And what he's saying is, if you look this word up, fool, what it actually means is worthless person, someone who's worthless. And what he's saying is, if you're okay with looking at another human and saying, you are worthless, then he said, that reveals something about your heart. So Jesus is questioning, if you can call somebody a fool, a worthless person, a worthless human, then has your heart even been transformed? Because a heart that's been transformed by the love of God would never look at a human and say that person is worthless, they have no value. So if you have a habit of calling people names, ugly names, it doesn't mean that you're not saved. The question is, do you really mean that about the person? But I would say this, that when you get in a habit of referring to people a particular way, understand that those words do have power. And that even maybe you don't feel that way, but when you start referring to someone a particular way, it can get into your heart, and you can start feeling that way about a person. And I want to read verse 23 again. It says, "So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift." So he's saying, if you're at church and you're offering your sacrifice of worship, you're offering your tithe, you're there to grow in the Lord, and you remember that you have a broken relationship with someone, or there's been an unforgiveness or something like that, he said you'd be better off just leaving church and going to fix that relationship first before you try to come in here and worship and lift your hands and sing songs, and you're going to pretend like you're not harboring unforgiveness towards somebody in your heart. And this is the same thing when you go to God in prayer. Maybe you had a fight with your spouse, or you have a rift or a division, a strife with somebody, and then you're just going to go and pray and pretend like it doesn't exist. God's going to say, we can't even get into prayer. We can't. Don't come in here and try to worship me and just pretend like this is such a big deal in the mind of God that you will not move forward in your relationship with me. This is what God is saying. You will not move forward in your relationship with me until you resolve this with your brother or your neighbor or your spouse. And so there's people that they haven't spoken to people in years. Like, they just harbor this unforgiveness they've been going on for years, and they think it's so totally fine just to keep going to church and acting like nothing exists. And what Jesus is getting at is here, you can't even be saved if you hold that kind of unforgiveness in your heart. Now, I understand there's some relationships that is completely not on our end. Like, we've totally forgiven the person, but there's still a breach in the relationship because of the other person. I totally understand that. I think God understands that. But even in this verse, notice what he says. If you are offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you. He doesn't say if you remember that you have something against your brother. He says if you even remember that there's somebody else that may have misunderstood something you did, somebody that's mad at you there's a misunderstanding, and they're holding it against you, he said you'd be better to go reconcile with them than to stay here and keep playing church. It would be better for you to go fix that with your neighbor. Let me just say this. Reconciliation, humble reconciliation, apologies, all should be a regular part of a believer's life. A regular part. There are some people that they won't apologize for anything. They won't apologize no matter what. They don't have enough humility to do it. But reconciliation, apology, making relationships right should be a regular part of a believer's life. Too many Christians are perfectly okay with broken relationships in their life. I mean, I think about Christian people, or people in the church at least, that have gotten divorces. It's shocking sometimes. You see two people, they go to church together, they build a life together, they build a family together, they try to walk in love towards one another, but the moment they start going through a divorce, it's like all that goes out the window. And you can during a divorce, you can begin to see a side of a person that you didn't even know existed. I mean, you think text messages, things can be said, names called, actions taken that no Christian could do. But somehow, because you're in the middle of a divorce, it becomes okay to act that way or treat another person that way. Well, the Bible gives us instruction about how we should treat our enemies, much less how you should treat somebody that you were married to, that you're supposed to be, in Christ with. But it's like believers are okay. They compartmentalize some of these things and how they treat people. And we need to understand that we are going to give an account to God for how we treat His sons and His daughters, how we treat our neighbor. We're going to give an account to God for that. So the first section we're studying tonight had to do with anger and having unforgiveness, anger in your heart towards another person. The second part Jesus deals with in verse 27 has to do with lust. He said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." There have been all kind of crazy ideas and thoughts that have come out of this passage. So I want to just begin with what Jesus is not talking about, okay? Number one, Jesus is not talking about noticing beauty. Right? He's not talking about seeing beauty in a person. He's not talking about noticing that someone is beautiful. God created man and woman to notice beauty. We notice beauty in people. We notice beauty in nature. We notice beauty in art. He's not talking about noticing, oh, someone is really attractive. No, you're hardwired to notice that. You can notice that your sister is beautiful or your mother is beautiful. You can notice that family members. So he's not saying that is wrong to notice that people are beautiful. Okay, number two, Jesus is not talking about being tempted to lust, but then choosing not to. There's a big difference. And I want to use this example to illustrate that point. Imagine that you're at work and you're left alone in a room filled with cash for whatever reason. There's no cameras. There's no evidence. If you take some of that money, there's no way that anybody's going to know. And at home, you were struggling to pay some bills, and the IRS is closing down on you, and you might be even facing jail time, and that cash is all of a sudden just looking really tempting to you, and you know that if you took it, no one would know, no one would miss it, and you had the opportunity to take it. And so for just a moment, you were tempted. But then you thought about God, and you thought about your integrity, and you said, it's not worth it. I'm not going to do it. And you walk out of that room. Is that the same thing Jesus is talking about? Is he saying, well, if you look upon some cash lustfully, it's the same as if you already took it, so you might as well take it? No, that's not. He's not talking about being tempted to do something, but then choosing what is right and walking away as being the same thing as if you'd already done it. We know instinctively, of course, that is not the same thing. We're all tempted on a regular basis to do things that we shouldn't do. Even Jesus himself was tempted in the wilderness to do things that he shouldn't do. Being tempted and truly desiring to do something that is wrong, but then choosing what is right, is not the same thing as if you'd gone ahead and done it anyway. So Jesus is not talking about being tempted to lust, but then choosing the right path and saying that, oh, that's the same thing as if you'd done it anyway. No, that is good. That's what we need to be. We need to be, when we're tempted, we need to say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to go the right path, and I'm going to go the right direction. So that's a good thing. So let's actually reread the verse as if he was talking about money. It would read this way: "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit theft.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at money with lustful intent has already committed theft in his heart." Notice that phrase right there. This is the key part. For everyone who looks at money with lustful intent. In other words, that would be as if you looked at the cash and you were about to take it, but then you noticed that there was a security camera in the corner. And that was the only thing that stopped you. So you had every intention of doing it and would have done it, except you noticed that there was a security camera in the corner. Then Jesus is saying it's the same as if you took it. Because you had the intention in your heart, the only thing that prevented you was that security camera, and if it had not been in there, you would have taken it. So now going back to the issue of lust, now we can understand what Jesus is saying. He's saying there are some people that turn away from adultery, or they don't participate in it, but it's only because they know they can't do it and get away with it. But if they could be 100% sure that they could do it and get away with it and no one would ever know, they would do it. And that's what Jesus is saying, is if that's the case, even if you never do it, even if you never participate in it, if it's in your heart, It's the same as if you've already done it. The other thing that becomes increasingly clear from this passage is that pornography is adultery. It is not a kind of adultery. It is not a form of adultery. It is adultery according to Jesus' definition. Now, I know that there are many people that would disagree with me, but if you disagree, you don't disagree from a biblical standpoint, because Jesus' words on it are too clear. If he is saying just the intention of the heart that you would commit adultery is the same as adultery, pornography is a whole step beyond that. It's several steps beyond that. You're actually taking action in that direction, and it makes no difference that the person that you are engaged with is on a screen. It makes no difference. If the person were there in your living room versus if they're on a computer screen, it makes absolutely no difference in the mind of God. Some may justify it that way, but in the mind of God, it makes absolutely no difference that you are fulfilling your lust with a person that is on a screen. And so it is adultery in the mind of God. And pornography is an enormous problem in our nation right now, and it is an enormous problem in the church right now. And part of the reason is because we have soothed our conscience and we have justified it not accepting the words that Jesus said here. We've looked at it as if, it's a lesser of the two evils. It's somehow not as serious or not as sinful as adultery or something like that. Jesus says it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And I believe it's a lie of the enemy to try to get people to believe that, it's not really the same thing. And furthermore, on that, what is the point of pornography? What is the design of pornography? It is to stir up lust and sexual desire in a person. And in marriage, only your spouse should be doing that. You should only be fulfilling sexual desire with your spouse. So anything that you use to fulfill that outside of your spouse is adultery, according to Jesus' definition. And that makes no difference whether it's a picture. It makes no difference whether it's a video. It makes no difference whether it's a novel. It's the same. Anything that you use to do that is an act of adultery, and Christians should have no part in it. So you say, okay, well, I'm struggling with that, so what should I do? Well, I just want to stop for a minute and say this. There's nothing I'm saying tonight that is to condemn a person. It's to bring truth, and it's to bring reality, and any hope of reconciliation and health in this area has to begin with reality. That's the only reason we talk about it the way that we do. It's the only reason that we are as strong with it as we are, because if you're gonna bring health and healing in a person's life, you got to start with reality. It's not going to be helpful to say, it's not that big a deal, Jesus loves you. No, it is a big deal. It is a big deal. And you say, so what should I do? Well, I'm going to just read you what Jesus said you should do about it, because he talks about the problem of adultery, and then in verse 28, and then in verse 29, he goes right into the solution for it, which none of us are going to like. None of us are going to like the solution that he gives. But remember this, the only reason that Jesus brought truth the way that he did was in order to bring freedom in people's lives. The Bible says that the truth will set you free. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. The only reason Jesus said things the way that he did was to bring freedom in people's lives. So the following passage that we're about to read, it is not intended to bring bondage or fear or anything. It is to lead you into freedom. Just remember that as we read this. So Jesus answers the question, well, what should we do about lust then if we're having a problem with it? Verse 29. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. This passage is like a splash of cold water right in the face of a person who is sleeping. It just stings. It's annoying. It just is frustrating to hear it because it's so aggressive. It's so aggressive. Well, if you have a problem with lust, just rip your eye out and throw it away. You have a problem with it? Cut your hand off, throw it away. Why? Because it's better for you to go to heaven missing an eye, missing a hand, than to burn in hell with both eyes and both hands. I don't know, and this is a question that always comes up, I don't know if Jesus actually intended for anybody to rip their eye out or cut their hand off. But I do know what he was trying to do here. What he was trying to do is to eliminate excuses of why we continue to sin. As a pastor, I get so fed up with excuses of why people continue to sin. Now, I'm not talking about someone who is actively fighting and resisting sin and they're doing everything in their power and they continue to slip or mess up. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone who's struggling with pornography or lust and then you suggest something like get rid of your phone. Oh, I can't get rid of my phone. My goodness, I can't get rid of my phone. So what Jesus would say is then go to hell holding your phone. Go to hell holding your phone since it's that important to you. Because if Jesus would tell you to rip your eye out or cut your hand off, he'd tell you to get rid of your phone. He would tell you to do whatever is necessary in order to be right with God. So I'm not telling you rip your eye out or cut your hand out. I really don't think that's what Jesus is saying. I think he's going all the way to the most extreme position and say, because of how serious hell is, you ought to be willing to do this. But it probably won't take that. But whatever it does take, you should be willing to do it. I can tell you, I've walked through people with addictions to multiple things. Maybe it's drugs, maybe it's pornography, maybe it's different things. It's never got a person that truly wants healing. It's never gotten to the point where we've had to rip their eye out or cut their hand off. It's never gotten to that point. We've always found healing way before we ever got there through just a few simple things. And I think what Jesus was trying to say here is you need to be willing to do whatever it takes to get rid of this, because if you have a persistent bondage and addiction in your life, it could lead to you going to hell. It's that serious. These are not my words, of course. These are Jesus's. So you can get, mad at me about it, but I'm just repeating what Jesus said. I didn't write this. He wrote it. And I believe he said it the way that he said it on purpose, because he wanted to wake us up and he wanted us to realize, no, get rid of the excuses. You can do what is necessary and do what it takes. The big focus for what we've been talking about tonight is what's going on in your heart matters. It's not enough that on the outside, visibly to everyone else, you look holy, you look righteous, you haven't murdered anyone, you haven't committed adultery on the outside. He says, no, there's underneath the surface in every person's life, in mine, in yours, and everyone's, underneath the surface, there are things going on in your heart. And what he's letting us know in this passage is that they matter. It matters what's going on in your heart, possibly even more so than what's going on the outside. It matters to God, and so it should matter to you.